ranking 15 different versions of Dorothy Gale. Published in 1900, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz was the first novel in L. Frank Baum's wildly popular Oz series, and introduced now iconic characters like the Wicked Witch of the West, Glinda the Good Witch, the Cowardly Lion, the Scarecrow, the Tin Man, and Dorothy Gale. Over the course of the series, Dorothy makes the most appearances of any character, either serving as the protagonist or being regarded as a sort of celebrity. This importance has carried over into pop culture, with the character being featured in the majority of projects based on The Wizard of Oz, regardless of their faithfulness to the source material. Today we're going to be taking a look at 15 versions of Dorothy Gale in film and TV, discussing her role in that specific story, what makes her unique, and even her outfit. Then we'll rank all of them. But first, a few disclaimers. Because there have been a lot of different Dorothys over the years, it'd be impossible to cover all of them, so my apologies if we missed your favorite. The rankings will be based on the character herself, not the quality of the project she appears in, because trust me when I say that sometimes a great character can be in a terrible movie. Also, even if the character isn't actually named Dorothy Gale, or if the plot isn't based on the original Oz books, as long as the inspiration is obvious, it counts. As always, this is my opinion, so it's totally fine if you disagree. Just don't be an asshole about it. Now that that's out of the way, let's get into it. The Wizard of Oz. Considered one of the greatest films of all time, 1939's The Wizard of Oz has had an immeasurable impact on all subsequent adaptations of the story, although if you ask me, none have managed to come close to its magnificence. In the film, Dorothy lives on a Kansas farm with her Uncle Henry, Auntie Em, and dog Toto. Although she expresses some slight dissatisfaction with the monotony of her life, it isn't until her grouchy neighbor, Mrs. Gulch, arranges for Toto to be taken away that Dorothy finally makes the decision to leave home. She doesn't make it very far before being convinced by a quack fortune teller to return, but just as she gets there, a cyclone arrives. Dorothy and Toto hide from the storm in the farmhouse, but the wind knocks her unconscious and picks the house up, dropping them in the magical and colorful land of Oz. Glinda the Good Witch of the North arrives, telling Dorothy that her house landed right on top of the Wicked Witch of the East, freeing the local munchkins from her tyranny. The Wicked Witch of the West appears during the celebration in an attempt to get her hands on her deceased sister's magic slippers, but they found their way onto Dorothy's feet. Because she's desperate to return home, Glinda tells Dorothy to follow the yellow brick road to the Emerald City, where the mysterious Wizard of Oz will be able to help her. Along the way, Dorothy meets the Scarecrow, the Tin Man, and the Cowardly Lion, and the group manage to reach the Emerald City despite the Wicked Witch's attempts to stop them. The four finally meet the wizard, who tells them he'll grant all of their wishes if they're able to bring him the Wicked Witch's broomstick. They set off for her castle, but Dorothy and Toto are captured by flying monkeys and brought to the Wicked Witch, who plans to kill Dorothy to get the magic slippers. The Scarecrow, Tin Man, and Cowardly Lion come to Dorothy's aid, but during the escape, the Wicked Witch and her henchmen are able to corner them. She lights the Scarecrow on fire, which Dorothy puts out with a bucket of water, accidentally splashing the witch, who melts away and dies. They return to the wizard, only to find that he's a charlatan with no magical powers, but he promises to help Dorothy however he can, offering her a ride in his hot air balloon so they can return to Kansas. However, at the very last moment, Toto jumps from the balloon, and the wizard takes off without them. Glinda reappears and reveals that the ruby slippers have the power to return Dorothy to Kansas, and after tapping her heels and saying there's no place like home, Dorothy wakes up in bed surrounded by her friends and family, with her adventure being implied to have been nothing but a dream. Allegedly, the sought-after role of Dorothy Gale was initially offered to 11-year-old Shirley Temple, who was one of the biggest box office draws of the 1930s, but whether because of contract issues or her vocal limitations, she didn't wind up getting the part, with 16-year-old Judy Garland being cast instead, which was definitely the right choice, considering one of the things that makes the film so memorable is her performance. Although Baum never specifies Dorothy's age in the novel, she's repeatedly referred to as a little girl, and over the course of the series it's implied that she's no more than 12 years old. Obviously, Judy Garland didn't look like a child, but the production still spent a good deal of time attempting to make her appear younger, which I never understood because Dorothy's age didn't seem all that important to the movie's message. In fact, I'd even argue that her early angst actually works better if she's a teenager as opposed to a child. In The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, Baum described Dorothy's dress as blue and white gingham, which was carried over into the film, as they felt that the busy print made Garland's figure less noticeable. They did wind up deviating from the story when it came to her footwear, however, with Dorothy's silver shoes being replaced with the now iconic ruby slippers. The bright color was chosen to take advantage of the film's Technicolor process, with red standing out against the yellow brick road better than silver, and the glamorous shade perfectly symbolized Dorothy's transformation from an ordinary farm girl into a powerful heroine. The character has a distinct journey, starting off the film yearning for a more exciting life before learning to appreciate it. And I like that we actually see her become frustrated with her family before realizing how important they are to her. While Dorothy is remembered for her kindness, she isn't afraid to speak out against injustices, which can change other characters for the better. She's both naive and curious, which on the positive side makes her more adventurous and brave, but on the negative end makes her prone to being taken advantage of. While her book counterpart is extremely level-headed and calm, to an unbelievable degree in fact, the film's Dorothy is a bit more emotional, which might come across as whiny to some, but I think it's more realistic since she's a stranger in a strange land. Return to Oz. Although technically a sequel to the 1961 TV series Tales of the Wizard of Oz, which followed Dorothy's various adventures, Return to Oz has the characters re-experience the events of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. So although Dorothy already knows everyone, she has to meet and rescue them all over again. The TV special starts off with Dorothy in Kansas receiving a letter from her friends back in Oz, who tell her that they all miss her. While searching for her silver shoes, she's taken back to Oz by another twister, landing in Munchkinville. Glinda arrives and tells Dorothy that the Wicked Witch of the West has come back to life after the cold weather froze her puddle, and she's now set on stealing Dorothy's magic shoes. In the meantime, the witch has also destroyed Rusty's new heart, Socrates' diploma, and Dandy's medal, leaving them without the brains, love, or courage that the wizard gifted them. She manages to rescue Rusty, Socrates, and Dandy, and they make their way to the Emerald City, where the Wicked Witch has taken over as ruler. As they attempt to hide from the witch, Rusty sacrifices himself to save them from a lightning bolt, but Glinda brings him back to life. Dorothy is eventually captured, but all of her friends do their part to rescue her, and when the witch finally gets her hands on the magic slippers, she's turned to stone and falls apart. With things in Oz back to normal, Dorothy makes a wish to return home, and another twister brings her and Toto back to Kansas. Although she's far more composed than the 1939 version, there's still a juvenile quality to her, coming across like a responsible big sister to her three crying brothers. Unlike other Dorothys who are often dissatisfied with their lives in Kansas, this Dorothy is pretty content, treating Oz as a place to have fun with her friends, as opposed to a place to escape to, and I do find that this lack of inner conflict makes her a bit less interesting. With lackluster animation and voice acting, the movie itself isn't great, but if anyone is looking for new audition material, the songs aren't half bad, in a melodramatic kind of way. Journey Back to Oz. Production for Journey Back to Oz began in 1962, but Filmation ran out of money and the unfinished movie was shelved for nearly 8 years. Judy Garland's daughter, Liza Minnelli, was cast as the voice of Dorothy, which I thought was quite sweet, as by the time the film was released, Garland had passed away. Mickey Rooney, Judy Garland's frequent co-star and lifelong friend, also appeared as the Scarecrow, while Margaret Hamilton, who played the Wicked Witch, ironically voiced Auntie Em, and I see the Journey Back to Oz as a loving tribute to the 1939 film and Garland herself. Loosely based on The Land of Oz, the second installment of the Oz series, the film begins with Dorothy trying and failing to convince her family of the existence of Oz. Shortly after, a cyclone appears, and during the storm, Dorothy is knocked unconscious. When she awakens, she meets a talking sign which confusingly points to the Emerald City in 3 different directions. She eventually continues on her way, but accidentally gets lost, where she meets Pumpkinhead, who works for Mombi, the evil cousin of the Wicked Witches of the East and West. Dorothy is later captured by Mombi, and discovers her plan to conquer the Emerald City with an army of green elephants. Pumpkinhead helps free her, and the group go to warn Scarecrow, who is now the King of Oz. Dorothy and Pumpkinhead meet Woodenhead Stallion III, a former merry-go-round horse who takes them the rest of the way, but they don't arrive in time, and Mombi proceeds to invade the Emerald City, capturing Toto and Scarecrow in the process. Dorothy, Pumpkinhead, and Woodenhead manage to escape and make their way to Tin Land to convince the Tin Man to help them, but he declines as he's afraid of the elephants. They then make their way to the forest to find the Cowardly Lion, who also rejects them, suggesting that they get help from Glinda the Good Witch instead. Glinda is similarly unable to help, telling Dorothy that she's Oz's only hope, and gives her a silver box of magic to use in emergencies. The group heads back to the Emerald City, and Mombi brings the trees to life to stop them, but Glinda sends them a golden hatchet, which turns the trees from bad to good. When they arrive in the Emerald City, the elephants attack once again, but Dorothy opens up the box, revealing dozens of mice who scare the elephants away. Realizing that she's going to lose, Mombi disguises herself as a rose to hide from Dorothy, but Toto goads the elephants into a stampede, killing Mombi and destroying all of her magic. However, this also kills Pumpkinhead, but Dorothy is able to revive him with her tears. With Oz free of Mombi's tyranny, the Scarecrow knights Pumpkinhead and makes Woodenhead the captain of the Oz Cavalry. Glinda then creates another cyclone, which sends Dorothy and Toto back to Kansas, where she makes amends with Aunt Em and Uncle Henry. The film is a lot kookier than others, reminding me a good deal of Disney's Alice in Wonderland, and even Dorothy herself seems inspired by the character. Besides the visual similarities like the Mary Jane shoes and headband, Dorothy is just as curious, stubborn, haughty, and demanding as Alice is, which I do think makes her a bit less likable than other versions. The character really only gets sad when Pumpkinhead is killed, which I find surprising since I was expecting her to feel betrayed by the Tin Man and the Lion. Like, this is the thanks she gets for saving your butts previously? Also, there's way too many musical numbers for my taste, and at a certain point, you just want Dorothy to stop singing, which I never thought I'd say about Liza Minnelli. 20th Century Oz. A reimagining of the 1939 film, 20th Century Oz moves the story to 1970s Australia, with Dorothy being a 16-year-old groupie who goes on the road with Wally and the Falcons, an up-and-coming rock band. After their van gets into an accident, she hits her head and is knocked unconscious, and the following day she wakes up alone in an abandoned town. She eventually stumbles upon a boutique called Good Fairy, where she meets Glenn, who tells her that her van hit and killed a local troublemaker. As thanks, he gives her a pair of red sequined platforms, which she wears on her way to the final concert of the Wizard, a mysterious glam rock musician. Glenn tells her to follow the highway to get to the city, and along the way she meets a dumb surfer, Blondie, whose car she fixes and hitches a ride with. At a gas station, they meet a grouchy mechanic, Greaseball, and a wimpy biker, Killer. Greaseball messes with Blondie's engine, forcing Dorothy to catch a ride with him, but before long, Greaseball's car similarly breaks down. Continuing on foot, she's picked up by Killer, and the two head to the beach. Greaseball and Blondie are eventually able to catch up, as is Glenn, who Dorothy continues the rest of the way with. Although the three boys started off on the wrong foot, they eventually band together, heading to the city to find Dorothy, who they now consider a friend. Dorothy is able to convince the doorman to let her into the concert, falling in love with the wizard during it. After the show, she attempts to meet up with him, but she's kidnapped by a group of thugs working for the brother of the man she ran over earlier, who had been following her the entire time. He takes Dorothy home and attempts to assault her, but the boys are able to save her in the nick of time. They make their way to the hotel the wizard is staying at, where Dorothy confesses her feelings for him. But just then, Glenn arrives, revealing himself to be the wizard's agent, and tells him that a relationship with Dorothy would be bad for his image, so the wizard rejects her. After throwing her heels at a mirror, she wakes up to see the van from the beginning of the film being towed, with the members of Wally and the Falcon looking at her in confusion. She then tells them that she hopes they don't wind up making it big, since fame and fortune will fuck them up. The movie perfectly captures the grittiness of the 1970s, with Dorothy's adventure being far more realistic than most. While far from glamorous, her journey helps her understand what she truly wants out of life, which is friendship and support instead of romance and stardom. I don't love a lot of films from this time period because they can be a bit gratuitous when it comes to violence and sex, but this movie is an exception, having some pretty progressive depictions of feminist issues and queer people. Sure, the boys technically rescue her from the villain, but Dorothy gets some licks in as well. Plus, I like that she's treated as a friend instead of a romantic interest, which took me by surprise since I was expecting at least one of the boys to attempt to woo her after the wizard's rejection. Although this reimagining of Dorothy's story is interesting, the character herself isn't. But I don't know if the writing or the acting is to blame for that. She swings back and forth from being a nervous wreck to overly confident, and since her only interest is meeting the wizard, she's kinda boring, especially when compared to some of the other characters, which is a shame because I think she had potential. This film marks our first blonde Dorothy, which is actually how the character was described in the novel, and I like how it gives her a sort of innocent girl-next-door vibe. It would have been easy for them to put her in a dress to make her look more like Dorothy at a quick glance, so I appreciate the switch to the more realistic blue jeans and crop top. I just wish there'd been some kind of reference to Toto. Maybe a brown fringe purse? Admittedly, the film is a bit repetitive visually, which I don't blame them for considering their limited budget, but it's still a cool look at the rock and roll scene from the time period, so it's worth checking out if that's something you're into. The Wiz. A loose adaptation of the 1974 musical, The Wiz puts an urban twist on the classic story. In Harlem, 24-year-old schoolteacher Dorothy Gale is celebrating Thanksgiving with her family, including her Aunt Em and Uncle Henry, who she lives with. After dinner, Toto runs out into the street, with Dorothy chasing after him, but she finds herself trapped in a storm, which transports them both to the land of Oz. During her descent, she kills Evermean, the Wicked Witch of the East, earning the gratitude of the Munchkins. Miss One, the Good Witch of the North, appears, giving Dorothy Evermean's magical silver slippers. She tells Dorothy to follow the yellow brick road to get help from the Wiz, but she struggles to find her way, stumbling upon a scarecrow made out of garbage. The two work together to find the yellow brick road, finally starting their journey, where they meet a Tin Man at an abandoned amusement park and a lion who has been banished from the jungle. When they finally reach the Emerald City, they meet the Wiz, who tells them he'll grant their wishes if they kill Evermean's sister, Eveline, who runs a sweatshop in Oz's sewers. Eveline sends her army of flying monkeys to capture them, tearing apart the scarecrow, smushing the Tin Man, and hanging the lion by his tail. When this fails to get Dorothy to relinquish her silver slippers, Eveline threatens to throw Toto into a cauldron, but Dorothy manages to turn on the fire sprinklers, which melts the witch. When they return to the Emerald City, they discover that the Wiz is nothing but a corrupt politician, but Dorothy tells her friends not to worry, as they've already proven that they have brains, heart, and courage. Glinda, the Good Witch of the South, appears, and tells Dorothy to use her slippers to return home, and after clicking her heels, she finds herself in Harlem with Toto. There are a good deal of differences between the original musical and the movie, most notable being Dorothy, who was aged up from a teenage girl in order to accommodate the casting of 33-year-old Diana Ross. Dorothy in the musical is similar to her book counterpart, growing tired of her humdrum life and yearning for adventure, which Aunt Em has little patience for. In the film, however, Dorothy is introverted and insecure, finding herself unable to leave the comforts of home out of fear of failure. This lack of independence, confidence, and purpose is a crucial part of her character, and her journey through Oz helps her find the strength to stand up for herself in spite of adversity. Sure, she's a pretty big wimp at first, which some people have criticized, but I like seeing that growth, and her stark transformation lets us know that this change isn't temporary. My biggest problem with this version of Dorothy is actually her wardrobe. While the look is true to the 1970s, it's unbelievably boring, especially when compared to the lavish costume design of the other characters. I get it, she's meant to be a humble schoolteacher, but it would have been nice to see her get some kind of makeover to signal her evolution, even if it just meant adding sequins to her dress to make it a bit more Halston-esque. The Wizard of Oz. This anime adaptation is notable for being more faithful to the original novel than most. After being transported to the land of Oz by a cyclone, Dorothy meets the Good Witch of the North, who gives her a pair of magical ruby slippers. She tells Dorothy to follow the yellow brick road to meet the Wizard of Oz, and before departing, gives her a protective kiss on the forehead. Dorothy meets and befriends the usual trio, but halfway to the Emerald City, they're attacked by a Khalida, a half-tiger, half-bear creature, but they manage to defeat it together. When they're granted an audience with the wizard, he meets with each of them individually, appearing to Dorothy as a large head, the Scarecrow as a beautiful woman, the Tin Man as a monster, and the Cowardly Lion as a ball of fire. They stay strong, impressing the wizard with their determination, so he agrees to grant their requests on the condition that they defeat the Wicked Witch of the West. The Wicked Witch spots them in her crystal ball and sends a pack of wolves to fight them off, but they're defeated by the Tin Man. She then sends a flock of crows, but the Scarecrow is able to scare them away. Finally, she sends an army of flying monkeys who manage to capture everyone except Dorothy, who is still protected by the Witch of the North's kiss. Dorothy attempts to save her friends, but is chased by the Wicked Witch, who she throws a bowl of water at, killing her. They return to the wizard and discover that he had no intention of granting their wishes, but he offers to take Dorothy back to Kansas in a hot air balloon. After he accidentally takes off without them, Glinda, the Good Witch of the South, appears and tells Dorothy to click the heels of her slippers 3 times, which transports her back home to Kansas, much to the joy of Aunt Em and Uncle Henry, who thought she'd gone missing during the storm. Other than being a bit bored of farm work, this version of Dorothy doesn't seem to have any complaints about her life in Kansas, and her relationship with Auntie Em and Uncle Henry is probably the least strained of the bunch. As a result, when she arrives in Oz, she doesn't seem as excited as the others, and requests to go home almost immediately. Now, I watched the English dub, so maybe the voice acting is different in the original Japanese, but I found this to be the ditziest Dorothy yet. She needs the same things explained to her repeatedly, and constantly misses things that happen right in front of her face. She also sounds a good deal bossier than other iterations, but that might just be Eileen Quinn's voice, which I can't separate from her role as Annie. Unlike other Dorothys, I didn't really buy the bond between her and the Ozians, and they just wind up feeling like a random group of people who were assigned to the same project. Return to Oz. Released during the 1980s dark fantasy craze that brought us Willow, The Never-Ending Story, Labyrinth, and Dragon Slayer, Return to Oz is an unofficial sequel to the 1939 film that also takes a handful of plot points from the third Oz book, Ozma of Oz. The film begins with Dorothy being taken to a sanatorium by Aunt Em, who's grown tired of the girl's seemingly delusional ravings about the land of Oz. She's put under the care of Dr. Worley, who plans to use electrotherapy to cure her. But before he can move forward with this experiment, a storm causes a power outage. During this mayhem, another patient rescues Dorothy, and they escape into a nearby river, floating away on a washed-up chicken coop. When Dorothy wakes up, she's joined by her chicken Billina, who can now talk, signaling that they've arrived in Oz. They make their way out of the deadly desert, where Dorothy finds a damaged yellow brick road. She follows it to the Emerald City, which is now in ruins, with its various citizens having been turned to stone. A group of wheelers, people who have wheels instead of hands and feet, harass Dorothy and Billina, and while hiding from them, Dorothy finds and turns on a robot named Tick-Tock, who had been told by Scarecrow to wait for Dorothy's return. Tick-Tock is able to defeat the wheelers, and the group head to the castle, where they meet Princess Mombi. Mombi reveals that the Scarecrow is being held prisoner by the Gnome King, then promptly locks Dorothy away, planning to let her grow up a bit before taking her head for her collection. There they meet Jack Pumpkinhead, who is brought to life by Mombi's magic powder, which Dorothy proceeds to steal, using it to bring a pile of furniture with the head of a Gump to life. They fly to the Gnome King's mountain with Mombi and the Wheelers in hot pursuit, where Dorothy finally reunites with Scarecrow, who the Gnome King transforms into an ornament. He forces each member of the group to look over his ornament collection and try to guess which one the Scarecrow is, but Gump, Jack, and Tick-Tock all fail, and are turned into ornaments as well. The Gnome King then reveals that Dorothy's lost ruby slippers were what gave him the power to destroy Oz, and he offers to use them to send her home, but Dorothy refuses to abandon her friends. She takes her turn at guessing, successfully managing to find Scarecrow, Jack, and Gump. But angry at being beaten at his own game, the Gnome King grows to a gargantuan size and attempts to eat them. But Billina, who had been hiding in Jack's head, lays an egg in his mouth that poisons him. Dorothy takes back her ruby slippers and uses them to transport them all back to the Emerald City, which has been returned to its former glory following the Gnome King's death. With Mombi having lost her powers, Princess Ozma is freed from her imprisonment and takes her place as the rightful ruler of Oz. She then sends Dorothy back to Kansas, who wakes up by the side of the river. Auntie Em and Uncle Henry find her and tell her that the sanatorium has burned down, killing Dr. Worley. She later sees Ozma in her mirror, but this time around, she doesn't tell her family, and for good reason, 'cause Lord knows they just lock her up again. Similar to the 1939 film, Return to Oz was riddled with production woes, with director Walter Murch even being fired at one point. Shooting also fell behind, bringing the production over budget, which wasn't helped by the fact that Disney had to pay a large fee to MGM in order to incorporate the ruby slippers into the story. While the Oz books touch on darker themes, the general public was really only familiar with the 1939 film, and comparatively, Return to Oz is basically a horror movie, something that divided audiences at the time. Age-accurate casting for Dorothy can be pretty difficult since a lot of child actors wouldn't be able to capture the nuances of her character, but 11-year-old Fairuza Balk managed to pull it off, which is even more impressive considering what was going on behind the scenes, with the young actress doing her own stunts and enduring freezing temperatures. Balk's portrayal of Dorothy is more fitting for this gloomy direction, still having a childlike innocence, but with hints of sorrow, fear, and madness that help you understand why her family is so concerned about her. She's brave, but still has her moments of doubt, which I find more realistic for someone her age, and I like that she never gives up, even when all hope seems lost. The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. This anime series included 4 story arcs that were loosely based on different Oz novels: The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, The Marvelous Land of Oz, Ozma of Oz, and The Emerald City of Oz. Each arc began with Dorothy home in Kansas before being whisked back to Oz to help save the kingdom from some dastardly villain. Compared to the Dorothys we've discussed thus far, this one is probably the most heroic, jumping from one adventure right to the next. Even when her group of allies grows, Dorothy remains the undeniable leader, often serving as the voice of reason. Although Dorothy is confronted by numerous villains, including the Wicked Witch of the West, Mombi, the Gnome King, General Ginger, and the Growlywog, she's unable to be hurt by them because of a protection spell she received from Glinda the Good Witch. She's by no means invincible, still being affected by things like dehydration or drowning, but her smarts are always able to save her. She's extremely logical and calm, which is useful when they're in a pickle, but this level-headedness does make her seem a bit older than she actually is. I'd call this Dorothy the most selfless of the bunch, putting the greater good above everything else, which can result in other characters occasionally taking advantage of this kindness. She honestly doesn't have any negative attributes, and this level of perfection makes her a bit uninteresting as the story progresses, since there's nothing more to really learn from her journey past the first arc. The Muppets Wizard of Oz. A contemporary take on the story, the film follows Dorothy Gale, an orphan living in a trailer park with her aunt and uncle. Although she currently works as a waitress, she dreams of becoming a singer, much to the chagrin of her family, who want her to be more realistic. One day she overhears that the Muppets are looking for a backup singer, but she accidentally misses the audition, and on the way home she gets swept up by a tornado. In Oz, the mouse-like munchkins tell her that the wizard should be able to grant her wish of becoming a famous singer, but before she heads on her way, she receives a pair of magical Manolo Blahniks. She proceeds to meet the usual trio, and the wizard tells them to bring him the Wicked Witch's magic eye in exchange for their wishes. The witch sends her flying monkeys to capture them, but the munchkins help set them free, and as they escape, Dorothy kicks the witch into a bathtub, which contains tap water that she's severely allergic to. Dorothy grabs the magic eye and travels back to the Emerald City with her friends, where they discover that the wizard has just been using movie effects to appear magical. However, he still has the power to grant Dorothy's wish, and he makes her a singer in the Land of Oz, but she realizes that she wants to be home with her family. She seeks out Glinda the Good Witch, who tells her that the silver shoes can bring her anywhere she desires, and Dorothy uses them to return to Kansas, where she finds out that she's been chosen to join the Muppets on tour. The film follows the typical Muppets format with people and puppets coexisting on screen, with Kermit playing the Scarecrow, Gonzo the Tin Thing, Fozzie Bear the Cowardly Lion, Pepe as Toto, and Miss Piggy as all of the witches. Jessica Simpson and Hilary Duff were in the running for Dorothy Gale, but Ashanti eventually won the part. Although she's a great choice for the music's pop direction, I don't think her acting chops were quite up to snuff, as evidenced by most of the characters' jokes falling flat, and oftentimes, the Muppets outact her. We're told that Dorothy wants to become a famous singer, but it never actually feels like it, which I think is because Ashanti can't quite land the emotional moments. Now before anyone says, well, it's a Muppets movie, what were you expecting? Please watch The Muppets Christmas Carol or Muppet Treasure Island, because those folks were acting. But at least Dorothy's outfits are cute. Tin Man. This Wizard of Oz Goes Steampunk miniseries followed DG, a waitress struggling to fit in her small Kansas town. One day, Ascadelia, a tyrannical sorceress who rules the Outer Zone, or the OZ, sends her soldiers to kill DG. DG is able to escape through a storm, which brings her to the OZ, where she meets Glitch, the former royal advisor who had half of his brain removed by Ascadelia, Wyatt Kane, a law enforcement officer who was locked in an iron suit as punishment, Ra, a part lion, part human psychic, and Tudor, a shapeshifter who is also a spy. As she spends more time in the OZ, DG slowly regains her magic powers as well as the memories of her past life. She learns that she and Ascadelia are the daughters of the former queen of the OZ, who Ascadelia has overthrown and imprisoned. As children, DG accidentally released an evil witch who possessed Ascadelia, and years later, DG was even killed by her, but their mother was able to bring her back to life before sending her to Kansas for her own safety. DG's memories also reveal the location of the Emerald of the Eclipse, which Ascadelia has been searching for, but before she can use it to shroud all of the OZ in darkness, DG is able to free her from the witch's possession. DG gets her name from Dorothy Gale, who is her great-great-grandmother, and the two characters go on near-identical journeys. Where they differ most is their personalities. Like Dorothy, DG similarly yearns for a different, more interesting life. She doesn't have any exact complaints about Kansas, she just feels like she's destined for more because she's so artsy and quirky and sarcastic. In other words, she's Zooey Deschanel. Her personality doesn't really evolve over the course of the series, and her eccentricities just wind up working in her favor instead of against her, which makes her come across as incredibly lucky instead of powerful. Legends of Oz: Dorothy's Return. Loosely based on the 1989 book Dorothy of Oz by L. Frank Baum's great-grandson, Legends of Oz sees an evil jester kidnap the different rulers of Oz after stealing the Wicked Witch's broomstick and turning it into a magical scepter. Back in Kansas, Dorothy's farm has been destroyed by a recent storm, and the entire town has been sent eviction notices. But before she can come up with a solution, Dorothy and Toto are suddenly transported back to Oz by a rainbow, but they're nowhere near the Emerald City. They soon meet Wiser, an owl who can't fly, and they find themselves in Candy County, where they're arrested by Marshal Mallow and taken to court. The judge realizes who Dorothy is, and they're released, and Mallow decides to join the group as they continue on their journey. They next enter Dainty China Country, but the jester damages the land with an earthquake, angering the China Princess, who demands to accompany them to the Emerald City. As they get closer, they're attacked by the flying monkeys, with the China Princess being shattered during their escape, and Dorothy heads to the Jester's palace on her own. There, she reunites with all of her friends, old and new, including a now flying Wiser and a repaired China Princess. The Jester summons a tornado in an attempt to kill Dorothy, but after she throws his scepter into it, he jumps in himself, breaking all of his spells, and Glinda is able to send Dorothy home. Once she's back in Kansas, she discovers that the eviction notices were fake all along, and after arresting the man responsible, they rebuild the entire town. This movie has a surprisingly stacked cast, with Dan Aykroyd as Scarecrow, Kelsey Grammer as Tin Man, Martin Short as Jester, Hugh Dancy as Marshal Mallow, and Lea Michele as Dorothy Gale. That must have been where most of the budget went, considering the writing, music, and animation are all pretty subpar. This version of Dorothy gets dejected more easily than others, although she does make some pretty speedy recoveries, tying into her Kansas storyline that sees her picking herself back up in the face of hardship. I also like how she sacrifices herself so no one else has to suffer, which is a different take on heroism than simply defeating the bad guy. Other than that, the character doesn't have a lot of depth, and with the story being pretty derivative of the usual Wizard of Oz formula, she just winds up feeling generic. Her cowboy boots are fun though. Once Upon a Time. As is customary for Once Upon a Time, some of Dorothy's characterization and storyline is pulled directly from the source material, while the rest is a pretty notable deviation. As usual, Dorothy is brought from Kansas to Oz by a tornado, where she meets the witches Zelena and Glinda. Although they initially get along well, Zelena discovers a prophecy about her own death that she attributes to Dorothy, and she sets out to kill the young girl, but in a state of panic, Dorothy accidentally splashes her with water. With Zelena seemingly dead, Dorothy and Glinda go to see the wizard, who gives Dorothy a pair of silver slippers that can teleport her anywhere. When she returns to Kansas, she tries to tell her family about her adventure, but they think that she's lying, all except Auntie Em, who gives her Toto before passing away. Years later, she discovers that Zelena is alive and well, prompting Dorothy to return to Oz. Ruby and Mulan eventually run into her and Toto, with the latter being captured by Zelena, who asks to trade him for Dorothy's now missing silver slippers. As the group try to brew a magic potion to stop Zelena, Dorothy and Ruby grow closer, with Ruby realizing that her feelings are more than friendly. But before she can confess, Dorothy disappears. Using a spell, Ruby tracks Zelena to the underworld, where she discovers that she's put a sleeping curse on Dorothy, one that can only be broken by true love's kiss. Ruby returns to Oz, and although unsure about the other girl's feelings, kisses her, and to her relief, Dorothy wakes up. This is the last that we see of both characters in Once Upon a Time, but we can assume that they had some sort of happily ever after. Our first Dorothy to have a real love interest also happens to be our first queer Dorothy, which feels like a no-brainer considering the Wizard of Oz's long-standing association with the LGBT community. When the character is a child, she's naive and nervous, allowing Zelena to play her like a fool, and she doesn't have any real impact on the main story. After being betrayed by her family and losing the only person she actually cares about, Dorothy becomes a cynic, but she does let her guard down around Ruby, but not enough to where I actually buy into their love story, which I'd say is the case for a lot of the later Once Upon a Time relationships. This sort of badass Dorothy was a novelty at the time, and I wish she'd made a few more appearances in the show, especially since we never got to see her modern-day self. Lost in Oz. 12-year-old Dorothy Gale II is quite the precocious child, often building gadgets and pulling pranks. One day she finds a notebook hidden under the floorboards of her house, which triggers a tornado that brings her and her dog to Emerald City. In order to return home, Dorothy has to collect every magical element in Oz, which is no easy task as the kingdom is currently experiencing a shortage. She later meets and befriends West, the great-great-granddaughter of the original Wicked Witch, and Ojo, a surprisingly large munchkin, who both decide to help her on her quest. Dorothy's attempts to return home are thwarted by the evil sorcerer Fitz and the Wicked Witch Langwidere, who plans to erase the memories of everyone in Oz. With the help of her friends, Dorothy is able to defeat them and return the missing magic to Emerald City, but just when she thinks she can finally head home, she's transported to the Deadly Desert. She slowly makes her way back to the Emerald City, but the corrupted General Guff sends her and all of her friends to Kansas. Although initially concerned that they'll be stuck there forever, they discover that the real world also has magic, which they use to return to Oz and save the city. This version of Dorothy has a big personality, and her creativity, intelligence, and curiosity makes her a formidable force in battle, and in spite of her age, you never question her abilities. This does, however, give her a pretty big ego, which not only causes problems between her and her friends, but can also result in her making pretty basic mistakes, which I think is true to life when it comes to these sorts of geniuses. She does have some adorkable quirks like sarcasm and awkwardness, but it isn't as grating as some other characters with similar traits. Maybe because it isn't her entire personality. Fantastic Journey to Oz. 1939's The Wizard of the Emerald City was a Russian re-narration of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, which changed most of the characters' names and added or removed a handful of plot elements. In the 1960s, the book saw a burst in popularity, resulting in author Alexander Volkov writing several sequels that were unrelated to the Oz series apart from a few minor details. Volkov's 1963 book, Orphanios and the Wooden Soldiers, served as the inspiration for 2017's Fantastic Journey to Oz, while his 1968 book, The Fiery God of the Marins, became the basis of the film's 2019 sequel, Fantastic Return to Oz. The first film introduces Urfin, who uses a magic powder to create an army of wooden soldiers that he plans to use to conquer all of Oz. Meanwhile, Dorothy Gale's granddaughter, also named Dorothy, finds the silver slippers, accidentally transporting herself to Oz. The Munchkins mistake her for her grandmother, begging her to save them once again, so she heads to the Emerald City to stop Urfin. The Scarecrow and Tin Man have already been captured, so Dorothy makes the journey with Toto and the lion. At one point, she nearly gives up and tries to return home, but the magic slippers stop working, so she has no choice but to continue. Urfin's creations have taken on a mind of their own, but by using the magic powder, Dorothy is able to defeat them, and with the townspeople's help, her shoes regain their power, allowing her to return home. In the sequel, Urfin returns to his wicked ways, using a magic spellbook to take control of the Emerald City once again. Dorothy's crush, Tim, accidentally winds up in Oz, where he's promptly captured, and Dorothy goes to Oz herself in order to save him, but she's trapped by an ogre, who she eventually escapes from in a hot air balloon. At the end of the film, Tim uses his cell phone and the silver shoes to defeat Irfin himself, and he and Dorothy finally admit their feelings for each other. Unlike other adaptations, she interacts most with Toto, who is a classic animal sidekick, but because he serves as the film's comedic relief, Dorothy isn't very entertaining on her own. Although she has her selfish moments, she's very loyal to the people she cares about. Even when she has good intentions, Dorothy's plans usually fail, making her more of a damsel in distress than a proper hero, which is pretty ironic in the second film when all of Oz decides to celebrate her, even though the Scarecrow, Tin Man, Lion, and Toto were just as, if not more helpful, than she was. Emerald City. Another modern reimagining, the story begins in Lucas, Kansas, where 20-year-old nurse Dorothy Gale lives with her adoptive parents. One day during a storm, Dorothy discovers a dead body, drawing the attention of a police officer, and as the weather gets worse, Dorothy hides in his car. The tornado carries her and the officer's canine to the land of Oz, where she discovers the body of the mistress of the Eastern Wood. Instead of being thanked, the members of the Munchkin tribe torture her until she's able to convince them of her innocence, where they subsequently warn her that the witch's death will make her a target. She makes her way to the Emerald City, where she stumbles upon Lucas, an amnesiac who begins falling in love with her. The two meet various residents of Oz, including Glinda and West, the strongest witches in the kingdom who harbor resentment towards the wizard who has outlawed magic. Having heard about Dorothy's arrival in Oz, the wizard sends one of his soldiers after her, but Dorothy's able to evade capture. After Lucas falls ill, they visit another witch, Mombi, for help, and simultaneously free her imprisoned ward, Tip, who transforms from a boy into a girl, revealing themselves as Ozma, the last surviving member of the royal family. The series culminates with Glinda and her army siding with Ozma and fighting the wizard, and following the battle, Dorothy is sent back to Kansas, where she begins to believe that her adventure was nothing more than a dream. Suddenly, Lucas arrives, telling her that an ancient beast has come back to life and is threatening the safety of everyone in Oz, and he begs her to return with him. The series was cancelled after this cliffhanger, so I guess we'll never know what happened to Dorothy next, but honestly, the story was already pretty convoluted. Not quite as fantastical as Once Upon a Time, nor as steampunky as Tin Man, The Emerald City was one of many edgy 2010s shows that sprinkled in graphic violence, sex, and drugs for shock value. The biggest theme of the series was science versus magic, with Dorothy being one of the rare few able to use both, making her the classic chosen one. The show forces contemporary feminist ideologies into a story that already had an inspirational message, turning Dorothy into a stereotypical girl boss, leather jacket and all. Instead of silver slippers, Dorothy is given a pair of bejeweled gloves, which activate her magic powers, although she's seen using a handgun just as often. Ironically, the most interesting aspect of the character is her relationship with Lucas, as we see them go from strangers to friends to lovers to enemies, and it's in their moments together that Dorothy's personality actually shines. Unlike other Dorothys who are unabashedly good, this one has moments where she's at risk of being corrupted, giving the character just a bit more depth. Now that we've gone through 15 different versions of Dorothy Gale, let's get to the rankings, starting from the worst and ending with the best. Now this is going to be heavily biased, so don't take it too seriously if your favorite isn't mine. The Wizard of Oz. There is nothing about this Dorothy that is remotely interesting. She doesn't hate Kansas, she never argues with Auntie Em, and she has no real connection to any of the Ozians. She's just some girl on a magical adventure. Return to Oz. Again, this Dorothy is lacking any sort of inner conflict that would make her a compelling character, but at least she's got some half-decent songs. Journey back to Oz. It pains me to put such a well-intentioned project this low, but this version of Dorothy just has one too many bratty moments to be likable. Sorry, Liza. Fantastic Journey to Oz. In the first film, she's a believable protagonist, but in the sequel, she turns into bland toast. Instead of letting all of the male characters fix things, it would have been nice to see her take charge a bit more. The Muppets Wizard of Oz. This version of Dorothy is better in theory than in practice. While I like the modern twist of her wanting to become a singer, Ashanti fails to deliver on any of the emotional moments, making Dorothy incredibly one-note. I do love her shoes though. 20th Century Oz. What disappoints me most about this Dorothy is her wasted potential. Instead of randomly switching her mood every 5 minutes, it'd have been nice to see her evolve from a nervous small-town girl to a confident city chick. Then the lesson that fame has consequences would hit just a bit harder. Legends of Oz, Dorothy's Return. The first Dorothy who actually has a personality. What I like most about her is that she isn't always chipper, since it makes her insistence to keep going all the more courageous. But her songs are boring. The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. If you watch the entire series in one sitting, Dorothy's storyline is pretty repetitive, but as a whole, it's obvious that they had a clear idea of what they wanted her to act like. Sure, she can be a bit of a goody two-shoes at times, but so is Dorothy in the novel. Tin Man. A classic, not like other girls' interpretation of Dorothy, I feel as though some of the nuances of the character were lost because Zooey Deschanel was just playing herself, but at least her backstory is interesting. Once Upon a Time. Even though it's an overused trope in the Once Upon a Time universe, I enjoyed seeing Dorothy evolve from a naive farm girl to a jaded warrior. I just wish we'd gotten one more episode so her relationship with Ruby could be a bit better developed. Emerald City. As much as I dislike the girl boss trope, Dorothy is still a decent character, all things considered. It's a bit stereotypical, but her struggle between good and evil is one that we don't usually see in Dorothy, and as cheesy as the romance can be at times, I like the conflict it brings to the story. The Wiz. I don't care if it's nothing like the stage production, I think this take on Dorothy is great. Plenty of adults are afraid to put themselves out there for fear of failing, and being able to watch Dorothy's confidence grow over the course of the film is honestly inspirational. Is Diana Ross the best actress in the world? No, but her singing and dancing more than makes up for it if you ask me. Lost in Oz. Besides being a creative take on the Wizard of Oz as a whole, they also did a great job of updating Dorothy for modern audiences. She's smart and capable without being annoying, and even when she has adorkable moments, they don't feel forced. Return to Oz. An age-accurate Dorothy in a live-action format is difficult to pull off, but Fairuza Balk nailed it. The character is still just as innocent and kind as always, but there's a darkness to her that adds another level to the story, and I do wonder how much of it was real. The Wizard of Oz. Besides being the most memorable Dorothy to date, Judy Garland's portrayal is a unique combination of sadness and glee, adding to the character's charm while also making you want to protect her. Plus, every song is an absolute banger. Considering all of L. Frank Baum's original Oz books are in the public domain, I'm surprised that we haven't seen more adaptations of the story over the years, especially since it's just begging to be turned into a modern rom-com. In fact, I actually have a pitch deck for one, so if someone from Hollywood wants to give me a call, that'd be cool. Which version of Dorothy Gale is your favorite? And what type of Wizard of Oz movie would you be interested in seeing in the future? I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you soon.